In the spring of 1887, in the Cypress lowlands south of the Sabine River, in the part of Texas where the land cannot decide whether it belongs to the water or the soil, a woman named Della Voss stood up to her knees in black swamp mud and put her hand on a thing that had been swallowed by the earth for 19 years. It was iron. It was the corner of an iron box the size of a feed trough, and it had sunk so deep that only one upper edge still broke the surface, furred green with algae and crusted the orange of old blood. The men on the bank laughed at her. They had laughed when she paid for it, and they laughed harder now watching her sink. They did not know what she knew. They did not know what her hands had been taught. Stay with me, because the thing in that mud was not empty, and the woman pulling at it had buried a man who taught her exactly how to open it. She was 29 years old that spring, and she had come to the settlement of Caddo Bend with $11 a mule and a leather roll of tools that had belonged to a dead man. The settlement was not much. A landing on the bayou, a store, a church that doubled as a school, and a scatter of houses on the high ground where the cypress thinned. People there made their living off the water and off salvage, off what the river carried down in flood and left behind when it pulled back. They were not cruel people, most of them. They were only certain, and certainty in a small place hardens into a kind of wall. Della had not been raised in the lowlands. She had been raised 300 miles north, in a railroad town where her grandfather kept a locksmith shop, and that fact is the whole of why this story turns the way it does. His name was Augustus Voss, and he had come west as a young man with a trade in his hands and a reputation that followed him from city to city. He could open anything. Banks hired him when a clerk died with the only combination in his head. Widows hired him when a husband locked the household money away and then locked himself into a grave. He was not a thief. He was the opposite of a thief, a man who restored what locks had stolen. And he raised his granddaughter at his bench because her mother was gone and there was nowhere else to put her. He taught her the way patient men teach, not all at once and never by lecture. He set a lock in front of her when she was 7 and told her to listen to it. He told her that iron has a voice, that a mechanism wants to be understood, that every wheel and lever inside a strongbox is only waiting for someone willing to hear it turn. By the time she was 16, she could open the practice safes in his shop faster than the men who apprenticed under him, and that was a thing he never let her say aloud, because he knew what the world did to a girl who was better than the men. When he died, the winter she was 27, he left her the bench, the tools, and a single sentence she would carry into the swamp 2 years later. He said, "The lock is honest. It will tell you the truth if you are willing to be told." She did not get to keep the shop. There was a debt against it she had not known about, a note her grandfather had signed to a man named Hollis Crane, and when the old man was in the ground the note came due, and the shop and the bench and the house all went to Crane's bank in a single afternoon of paper. She kept the tools because tools were not collateral. She kept the mule because the mule was hers. And she went south because south was where she had heard a person could buy a piece of ground cheap and start over. And because grief is easier to carry when you are moving. That is how a master locksmith's granddaughter came to be standing in a salvage yard at the edge of a Texas swamp on a gray March morning, watching an auctioneer try to sell a rusted iron safe that no one wanted. The safe had a history, and the history was the reason it sat unsold. 19 years before, in the high water of 1868, a steamboat called the Marie Lenoir had gone down in the bayou below Caddo Bend, dragged under by a snag in the night with most of her cargo aboard. The boat had carried the strong box of a cotton factor, an iron safe said to hold the season's receipts, and a quantity of gold, and when the boat sank, the safe went into the mud with it. Men had tried to raise it for years. The boat rotted and broke apart and gave up her timbers one by one, but the safe stayed where it fell, too heavy to lift with the tackle the settlement could muster, and slowly the swamp closed over it. By 1887, it was a story more than an object, a thing children dared each other to wade out and touch. Then a dry winter dropped the water lower than anyone living had seen it, and the corner of the safe broke the surface, and the man who held the salvage rights on that stretch of bayou decided he would rather have a few dollars than a legend. He put it up for sale where it lay. He could not move it. He sold it as it sat in the mud, and he told every bidder plainly that they would have to get it out themselves. No one bid. The thing was a curse as much as a safe. Men remembered the ones who had drowned trying to raise it in the early years, 2 brothers in 1871 whose names were still spoken at the store, and they had decided long ago that whatever was inside was not worth what it cost to reach. The auctioneer, a heavy, good-natured man named Pell, had nearly given up when the woman with the mule raised her hand and offered $4. The yard went quiet. Then it laughed. Pell laughed too, but not unkindly. He asked her if she understood that the safe was at the bottom of a swamp. She said she understood. He asked her if she understood that the man who sold it would not lift a finger to help her get it out. She said she understood that as well. He asked, with the whole yard listening, what a woman alone meant to do with a sunken iron box that grown men had died trying to move. And Della Voss looked at him with the steadiness her grandfather had drilled into her across 20 years of mornings, and said only that she meant to open it. They sold it to her for $4 because no one else wanted the joke. A man near the front said loud enough for all to hear that she had bought herself a very expensive bathtub, and the yard laughed again, and a woman near the wagons told her neighbor that the poor thing must have come unhinged by grief to spend money on a sunken curse. Della heard all of it. She paid Pell the $4 in coin, counted out slow and exact, and she signed the bill of sale in a clean hand that surprised the auctioneer, and somewhere in that laughter the story of her vindication began, though not one soul there could have known it. What did you make of a thing the world had given up on? That was the question she carried into the water. And it is the question I would put to you before this is over. She did not try to move the safe. That was the first thing the settlement got wrong about her, and it was the thing that revealed how little they understood. The men who had drowned had tried to raise the whole box to drag tons of waterlogged iron up out of sucking mud, with ropes and mules and the strength of their backs, and the swamp had killed them for it. Della had no intention of raising anything. Her grandfather had taught her that you do not fight the weight of a thing you mean to open. You go to where the weight does not matter. You go to the lock. The lock, though, was underwater, buried in mud, and before she could reach it, she had to do the patient, unglamorous work of making a place to stand. She spent her first 3 days not touching the safe at all. She walked the bank. She studied how the water moved, where the current was slack and where it pulled, and she found the old pilings of the steamboat landing still standing in the shallows, gray and hard as stone. She cut cypress poles and drove them into the mud around the safe in a ring. Working from a flatboat she rented from an old man named Theo Bell for the price of mending the lock on his smokehouse door, which she did in under a minute while he watched, and which was the first time anyone in Caddo Bend saw her hands do the thing they were made for. Theo Bell was the only person who did not laugh. He was past 70, a freedman who had come to the bayou after the war and stayed, and he had been a boy on the docks of New Orleans when he learned that the people who underestimate you are giving you a gift, because a man who thinks you are nothing will tell you everything. He watched her drive her ring of poles, and he watched her stretch a tarred canvas around them. And on the 3rd evening he came out in his own skiff and asked her what she was building. She told him she was building a wall to hold the water back, not from the whole swamp, just from one square of mud the size of a wagon bed, just long enough and just dry enough to let her dig down to the door of the safe and do her work. He looked at the ring of poles and the canvas and the safe's one green corner, and he understood it before she finished explaining, and he said he would help her. She asked him why. He said because he had spent 50 years watching men laugh at the wrong people, and he had a mind to see how this one came out. So they worked together, the young woman and the old man, and the settlement watched from the bank and made its jokes and waited for the swamp to win. For 9 days they baled and dug. They drove the poles deeper and packed the gaps with clay and cypress bark, and they baled the muddy water out by the bucketful, and the swamp pushed back every night, seeping in under the canvas so that each morning began with the water they had removed the day before. It was the kind of labor that breaks the spirit before it breaks the body, repetitive and slow and seemingly without progress. And there were evenings when Della sat on the flatboat, with her arms shaking and her hands split open at the knuckles, and could not have said whether she was closer to the safe than she had been at dawn. The work was honest, though, and honest work accumulates whether you can see it or not. On the 10th day the level inside the ring dropped below the level outside and stayed there, and they knew the wall was holding. On the 11th day they dug down through 3 feet of black muck and reached the top of the safe, and for the first time Della Voss saw the whole of the thing she had bought. It was larger than she had thought. It stood nearly 4 feet tall, an old fire safe of the kind made before the war, cast iron with a riveted seam and a heavy door, and it was rusted to a single fused mass on the outside. The hinges gone to orange lace, the keyhole packed solid with hardened silt. Theo looked at the rusted face of it, and said quietly that he did not see how any key on earth was going to turn in that. Della crouched in the mud and put her hand flat against the cold iron door the way her grandfather had taught her to greet a lock before she worked it, and she said that she was not going to use a key. Here is a thing worth knowing about old safes, and about the woman who understood it when no one else did. A lock that is rusted shut cannot be opened by force without destroying what it guards, because force applied to a sealed iron box at the seam will warp the door and crush whatever lies against it. But a lock is not the only way into a safe. A safe is a box, and a box has 6 sides, and the door is only the side the maker expected you to attack. Augustus Voss had taught his granddaughter that the man who built a safe spent all his cleverness on the door and almost none on the back, because the back was meant to sit against a wall where no thief could reach it. The back of a fire safe was its weakness. The back was where you went when the door would not come. She could not reach the back, though, and that was the trap the swamp had set. The safe sat upright in the mud with its door facing the open water and its back sunk into the bank, and to reach the back she would have to turn 4 feet of solid iron a half turn in a pit of muck, and that was the one piece of brute strength the work required, and the one piece she did not have. She tried. She set her shoulder against the cold iron at dusk on the 11th day and pushed until the muscles of her legs trembled and gave, and the safe did not move the width of a finger, and she sat down hard in the mud and breathed and tried again, and again it did not move. This was the black moment of her labor, the day she understood that her skill alone was not enough, that the swamp had set the safe down in the one position that defeated her, and she sat on the edge of her dry pit with the iron at her feet and saw no way forward. She thought of her grandfather then, and of the thing he had said about iron having a voice, and she thought that this particular piece of iron was telling her plainly that it had no intention of being charmed. She slept badly that night on the floor of the flatboat. She woke with no answer and a body that ached in every joint, and she might have given up if she had been alone. She was not alone. It was Theo who found the way, and the way he found it tells you something about who he was. He did not offer to lift it. He was old, and his back was not what it had been, and false strength offered at the wrong moment kills people in a swamp. Instead, he looked at the pilings of the old landing. The steamboat pilings standing hard in the shallows 40 feet off, and he remembered being a young man on the docks and watching the stevedores move things that weighed more than houses with nothing but rope and the patience to use it. He told Della they did not need to be strong. They needed to be clever about where the strength came from. They needed a purchase, so they built one. They rigged a block and tackle to the nearest piling, a double pulley Theo had kept oiled in his smokehouse for 30 years, against a day he could not have named, and they ran a line down into the pit and around the body of the safe padded with sacking, so it would not bite, and they took up the slack a finger at a time. The mule did the pulling. Della did the watching, because the danger was that the safe would come over too fast and pin one of them, and she stationed Theo on the high bank with the mule and stayed in the pit herself, calling the pace, easing the iron over degree by degree as the mud released it with a long sucking groan that the settlement heard from the store. It took them most of a day to turn the safe a half-turn in its pit, and when it finally settled onto its door with the riveted backplate facing up at the gray sky, Della Voss climbed out of the mud, and she was shaking, and she was not done. But she had won the part. That strength decides. The rest was hers alone. She sent Theo home to rest. She stayed. That night, by the light of a lantern hung on a cypress pole, the granddaughter of Augustus Voss began the work she had been preparing for her whole life without knowing it. The back plate of the safe was riveted, not welded, the old way. Dozens of iron rivets sunk through the plate into the frame, and rust had fused them into the body, so that to the eye there was no plate at all, only a single corroded surface. But Della did not work by eye. She cleaned the back plate with a wire brush and lamp oil until the heads of the rivets showed as faint circles in the iron, and she counted them. And she found the pattern, and one by one through the night she cut them. She did not have a forge. She had a cold chisel, a hand drill, and the dead man's tools, and she set the chisel to each rivet head at the angle he had taught her, and drove it with a 4-pound hammer until the head sheared and fell into the mud, and then she drilled out the shank, and then she moved to the next. There were 41 rivets. She counted them as she worked the way her grandfather counted the wheels of a combination lock, out loud and unhurried, because counting kept the panic small and the hands steady. The cold ate into her through her wet clothes, the lantern threw her shadow huge against the canvas wall. Somewhere out in the dark the swamp made its endless small noises, the plop of a turtle, the cough of a heron, the long sigh of mud settling, and Della Voss cut iron in the middle of it and did not stop. The chisel slipped twice in the small hours and took the skin off the back of her left hand, and she wrapped it in a strip torn from her petticoat and kept on, because a man who stops at the first blood, her grandfather had said, never finishes anything worth finishing. She found a rhythm that the body could keep when the mind grew tired. 4 blows to shear a head and a count of 10 to rest the arm, 4 blows and 10, and she moved around the plate by lantern light like a clock going slowly backward. By the gray of the next dawn, she had cut 30 rivets. By noon, she had cut the last, and her right hand had curled so stiff around the hammer that she had to pry her own fingers open one at a time. And still the plate would not come, because rust had welded the seam itself, and so she did the final patient thing. She took a thin blade and a wooden mallet, and she went around the whole seam tapping, working the blade into the rust line a hair at a time all the way around, top and sides and bottom, listening to the change in the sound as the blade found the gap, because iron has a voice and she had been taught to hear it. When she had worked the seam loose all the way around, she set the blade aside and put both her split and bleeding hands flat against the plate, and she did not pry, she pushed, steady and even, the way you push a stubborn door that you know will give if you only ask it correctly. And the plate gave. It came away from the frame with a groan and a breath of air that had been sealed inside that box for 19 years, cold and strange and smelling of old paper and oil, and Della Voss looked into the dark interior of a thing the world had given up on. What she saw there she did not expect. She had told the auctioneer she meant to open the safe, and she had believed, like everyone else, that what was inside was the steamboat factor's gold. There was no gold. There was, instead, a thing far heavier, and it took her a long moment in the lantern light to understand what she was looking at. The interior of the safe was dry. The seal had held, and the fire lining had done its slow work, and the inside of that iron box was a room frozen out of the year 1868. There was a leather satchel, cracked but whole. There was a tin document case. There were ledgers, 3 of them bound in green cloth, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a child's tin cup, and a daguerreotype in a hinged case of a woman holding an infant. And there were papers, so many papers folded and stacked and filling the body of the safe to the top. And when Della lifted the first ledger out into the light and opened it, she began to understand that she had not bought a treasure. She had bought a grave's worth of truth, and the truth belonged to someone. She did not understand all of it that first morning. She was too tired, and her hands hurt too much to turn the brittle pages with care, and so she did the disciplined thing. She closed the satchel and the cases, and she carried the contents of the safe to Theo Bell's dry cabin, 1 armload at a time across the flatboat, and only when every page was under a roof and out of the swamp air did she sit down at his table and begin to read. It took her 4 days to read it all, and as she read, the story of Caddo Bend rearranged itself around her, because the papers in that safe were the records of a robbery that the settlement had spent 19 years calling an act of God. The cotton factor whose safe had gone down with the Marie Lenoir had been a man named Edmond Riall, and he had not been merely a factor. He had been the keeper of the records for half the small landholders of the bayou, the black families and the poor white families who had bought their few acres on credit after the war and who could neither read the papers they signed nor keep them safe from fire and flood. Riall had held their deeds and their notes and their receipts in his iron safe as a service, and he had charged them for it, and for years it had been an honest arrangement. The ledgers told the honest part plainly, a careful hand recording each payment, each acre, each family's slow climb toward owning the ground under their feet. The letters told the other part. In the last year of his life, Edmond Riall had fallen into the debt of the bank at Jefferson, the upriver town, and the man who held that bank had offered Riall a way out. The deeds in his safe could be quietly altered. A receipt could go missing. A note marked paid could be marked unpaid, and the land it secured could be foreclosed and resold, and the families who had paid for that land could be turned off it with papers that said they had never paid at all. Riall had agreed. The letters were his correspondence with the banker, growing colder and more businesslike as the scheme matured, and the last of them, dated 3 days before the Marie Lenoir went down, named the families who were to lose everything, and the amounts the 2 men would split between them. The banker's name in those letters was Hollis Crane. Della Vos sat at Theo Bell's table with the lamp burning down and understood, all at once, that the man who had taken her grandfather's shop and the man who had built his fortune on the ruin of these bayou families were the same man, and that the safe she had bought for $4 as a joke held the proof that could undo 19 years of his work. She did not feel triumph. She told Theo later that what she felt was closer to fear because she understood for the first time how heavy the thing in her hands had become, and how many people it could lift or break. Hollis Crane was still alive. He was an old man now, upriver in Jefferson, rich and respectable, a name on a bank and a name on a church, and a name carved into the cornerstone of the courthouse he had paid to build. The Marie Lenoir had gone down before he could complete his scheme, the proof of it sinking into the mud with Edmond Riall, and Crane had spent 19 years believing his secret was buried where no man could reach it. He had foreclosed on what he could without the safe's papers, and he had let the rest lie, and the families of Caddo Bend had spent 2 decades half believing they had somehow lost ground they could have sworn they paid for, never able to prove it, their deeds and receipts all gone to the bottom of the bayou with the boat. Theo Bell knew those families. He named them for her across his table. The Greers and the Suttons and his own cousin's people, the Marches, who had lost 40 acres of good bottomland the year the boat sank and had never known why. He had been one of the men who tried to raise the safe in the early years, he told her then, and he had stopped not because he feared the water, but because he had come to believe there was nothing in it worth a man's life. He had been wrong about that. He sat with the green ledgers open in front of him, and the lamp shaking a little in his old hands, and he said that he had touched that iron 100 times, and never once known he was touching the deeds to his own cousin's land. Della asked him what he thought she should do. It was the only time in the whole of it that she asked anyone what to do, and she asked it of him because the answer belonged to him and his people more than it belonged to her. Theo was quiet a long while. Then he said that Crane was old and would die soon, whatever anyone did, and that no rope and no jury would give him back the years the families had lost, and that the only justice worth the name was the kind that put the land back under the feet of the people it belonged to. He did not want Crane punished. He wanted the Marches to have their 40 acres. He wanted the truth set down where it could not sink again. So that is what she did, and the way she did it was the quiet way, the way her grandfather would have recognized, the way that does its work without a shout. She did not ride to Jefferson and confront Hollis Crane. She never met him, not once. In the whole of this story, what she did instead was slower and surer. She had the ledgers and the deeds and the altered notes and the letters in Real's own hand and Crane's own hand, and she had a thing rarer than all of it, which was the original receipts, the ones the families had been given and had lost, recorded in Real's careful ledger before the alterations, so that the true account and the false account could be laid side by side and read by anyone. She took Theo Bell, who was respected, and she took the green ledgers, and the two of them went to the one man in the district with the authority to act on them, and the distance from Crane to do it honestly, a circuit judge named Asa Coyle, who held court at Caddo Bend twice a year. She did not accuse Crane of anything. She did not have to. She laid the ledgers on the judge's table and showed him the true account and the false account, and she showed him the letters, and she let the paper do what paper does when it is honest, which is to tell the truth to anyone willing to be told. Judge Coyle read for a long time. He was a spare gray man who had ridden the circuit for 20 years and had learned to distrust anything told to him in a loud voice, and Della told him everything in a quiet one. He turned the brittle pages with a care that told her he understood what they were before she said a word. Then he asked her how she had come by it, and she told him plainly the swamp and the $4 and the 41 rivets, and he looked at her hands, which were still wrapped in linen, and he believed her, because no one would invent a thing so strange and so specific. He asked Theo Bell whether he would stand behind the account, and Theo, who had carried the weight of 50 years to that table, said that he would stand behind every line of it, and that he had a cousin who had lost 40 acres he could now name the date of. The judge closed the last ledger gently, the way a man closes a Bible, and he said that he had heard a great many cases built on a man's word, against a man's word, and that this was the first he had seen built on iron and ink. He said he would act on it. He did. The undoing of Hollis Crane did not happen in a courtroom with him, shouting from the dock. It happened in the slow turning of paper through the months that followed. The deeds were filed true. The foreclosures built on the altered notes were challenged one by one, and the records in the green ledgers in Real's own hand, dated and detailed beyond any forger's skill, could not be argued against. The land came back. The Marches got their 40 acres, and the Greers their 20, and the Sutton family the river frontage that had been taken from them the year the boat went down. Crane fought it through lawyers for a while, the way a man fights the tide, and then he stopped fighting, because there was nothing to fight, only the patient weight of the truth he had thought was buried. He died the following winter. Upriver, an old man whose name was quietly being chiseled off the cornerstones he had paid for. Della Voss did not go to look. His dissolution was not the point, and she understood that even as the settlement that had laughed at her now wanted to make her the hero of his downfall, she refused the part. When the men at the store who had called her safe an expensive bathtub now wanted to shake her hand and tell her they had known all along that there was something to her, she let them shake her hand, because there was no profit in cruelty even toward people who had been careless with her, but she did not let them make her into a giant killer. She had not killed anyone. She had opened a box. What she did keep was the thing the box was supposed to have held and never did. There was no gold in Edmund Real's safe, but there was, folded among the papers, a sum of paper money, the season's receipts of 1868, water-stained but legible, and by the law of salvage it was hers, the contents of a thing she had bought fair and opened with her own hands. It was not a fortune. It came to a little over $600, a sum that would have meant a comfortable life to the woman who had arrived in Caddo Bend with $11 and a mule. She did not keep it. She divided it. She gave the largest share to Theo Bell, who tried to refuse it, and whom she would not allow to refuse it, because the block and tackle, and the 50 years of watching, and the cousin's land, were worth more than money, and she meant him to know it. She divided the rest among the families whose deeds the safe had carried, not as charity, she was careful to say, but as their own, since the money had ridden down into the mud beside their stolen land and had come up with it. And she kept for herself only enough to buy the small piece of high ground at the edge of Caddo Bend that she had come south to find in the first place, a few acres of cypress and pasture above the flood line where the swamp could not reach. She built a shop there, not a large one. A bench, a forge she taught herself to use that summer, a rack for the dead man's tools, and a sign over the door that said nothing but a single word, which was her name. People came to her from up and down the bayou with locks that would not open, and keys that had been lost, and strong boxes whose combinations had died with the men who set them, and she opened them, and she never once failed, because she had been taught by a master, and she had proven on a sunken iron box in a swamp that there was no lock the patient hand could not be told the truth by. Theo Bell lived another 6 years, and he spent a good part of them sitting on the bench outside her shop in the afternoons, telling the story to anyone who would listen, the story of the $4 safe and the 41 rivets, and the woman who turned 4 feet of iron in a pit of mud with nothing but a mule and a dead man's pulley. He told it better than I can. He had been there. And when he told the part where the backplate gave and the cold air of 1868 came out of the box, he would always stop and let it sit, the way a good chronicler does, because some things are heavier when you say them slowly. Delavos kept the iron safe. She did not sell it for scrap, though men offered. She had Theo help her haul it up out of the swamp at last, now that it was empty and light enough to move, and she set it in the yard beside her shop, the backplate set crooked against the frame where she had pushed it free, the 41 rivet holes still showing in a pattern she could have drawn in her sleep. She planted nothing around it, and she painted nothing on it. She let it rust the way iron rusts, slowly and honestly, and it stood in her yard for the rest of her life as the first thing a visitor saw, a battered iron box that the whole settlement had once laughed a woman for buying. Children asked her about it sometimes, the children of the families whose land it had carried, who were growing up now on ground that was theirs because of what that box had held. She told them the truth, which was that it had been thrown away once and dismissed, and called worthless by everyone who looked at it, and that it had been none of those things. She told them that the world is full of things it has given up on too soon, and that the difference between a worthless thing and a priceless one is very often only whether anyone was willing to do the patient work of opening it. On the last evening of this story, years on, an old woman now herself, Delavos sat in the doorway of her shop in the last of the light, and the rusted safe stood in the yard where it had stood for 30 years, and her hands, scarred across the knuckles in a pattern she had earned in one cold week in a swamp, rested quiet in her lap. The mule was long dead and buried. Theo was long dead and buried. Her grandfather had been gone the better part of her life. But the bench was inside, and the tools were on it, oiled and ready, and the lock was honest, and it would tell you the truth if you were willing to be told. She had been willing. That was the whole of it in the end. Not strength and not luck, and not the gold that was never there. Only the patience to hear a thing out, and the refusal to believe that what the world threw away was worth nothing, and a pair of hands that a dead man had taught to listen to iron. Did you ever own a thing that everyone told you to throw away and keep it anyway because some quiet part of you knew better? Tell me about it if you would. And if this is the kind of story that holds you, the kind where the patient hand outlasts the careless world, there is another like it waiting, about a woman and a thing the river gave back.